Every new day at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant leads Ukraine and European countries closer to a disaster. The water supply system that directly supplies water to the cooling system of the reactor itself is damaged. Every day there are new shell craters and new destruction. Last week, the sector where the 6th and 4th power units are located was under attack. A 155mm projectile from cannon artillery was fired in that direction. The projectile landed about 120 meters away from the 4th power unit. If it is destroyed, the lethal radius will be more than 100 kilometers, and the radioactive cloud will cover Europe as well. The carrier part of the MLRS Uragan projectile scattered cassettes with striking elements over the territory of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. From there, one can easily reach the power units on one side, and on the other there are only 30 meters to the nuclear waste storage facility. A possible accident at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant as a result of shelling by the Ukrainian armed forces can be comparable in its consequences to the tragedies in Chernobyl and Fukushima. In the event of radiation release, the consequences will be catastrophic not only for the Zaporozhye region. Experts believe that if the backup diesel generators and mobile pumps fail, the reactor core will overheat, as a result of which the reactor plant will collapse. Radioactive substances will be released into the atmosphere, and then they will be carried hundreds of kilometers away. According to them, the accident at the Ukrainian nuclear power plant could become a real disaster for the entire Europe, and not only the Crimean Canal, but also the Black Sea could suffer from the release of radiation. Let's consider all the opinions and look at the possible scenarios of the situation development around the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Back in March, a major fire broke out near the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, after which the plant was under fire several times, and more news about that has been coming in recent weeks. At the same time, there are more and more questions as well. I will try to explain what the shelling of this nuclear power plant could threaten and whether a second Chernobyl could happen from a technical point of view. It's not so much scary if a shell hits the building where the reactor compartment and engine room are located, but if it damages the auxiliary services that ensure the operation of the reactor. That is, the supply of cooling water, the supply of electricity for the operation of the cooling pumps, and so on. And when the artillery is firing randomly, without knowing exactly what to aim at, it can accidentally damage the operation of support services. If the supply of cooling water stops, then the consequences will be similar to the Fukushima accident. If the power supply is disrupted, then the reactor cooling pumps will stop working, and this can also lead to a disaster. The consequences of the explosion at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant may be more powerful than at the nuclear power plant in Chernobyl. If there was a 30-kilometer protection area in Chernobyl, in this case it will stretch to Switzerland. All this territory will be in barbed wire. If you have seen the photos of how the city of Pripyat is fenced with a barbed wire, you can only get there with a special pass. This is a dead city. In the event of an explosion at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, there will be dead Europe. The geography of the consequence of the explosion at the nuclear power plant to a large extent depends on the direction of the wind. Where the release of radiation will reach depends on where the wind is blowing. After the accident at Chernobyl, for example, the radioactive trace circled the globe 4 times. Traces were almost in Iceland. There were many contaminated areas in France that they don't even talk about and don't remember at all. After the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the city of Severodvinsk in the Arhangelsk region was one of the first to raise the alarm. They had automatic background radiation meters. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the siren wailed. They checked. Everything seemed to be fine. After a while, the wind blew again and again. The meters showed the raise in the level of background radiation. And this happened 3 times. And only in the morning they learned that an accident had occurred in Chernobyl. This is how far it was, how many thousands of kilometers. Andrei Zharovsky, engineer-physicist, expert of the radioactive waste safety program of the Russian Social and Ecological Union, explains that the threat at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is posed by the radioactive substances in fresh nuclear fuel, in spent nuclear fuel, and also in radioactive waste. They are located in different parts of the plant. Leaks to the environment can occur. What must be avoided? First of all, we need to watch the nuclear reactors. Secondly, we need to watch the radioactive waste storage facilities. There are calculations made by scientists that in the event of the destruction of a nuclear reactor at the nuclear power plant, heavy radioactive contamination can be observed at a distance of up to 200 kilometers and can reach the Kursk region of Russia. With the destruction of the storage facilities for spent nuclear fuel, the size of the issue may be smaller, a few tens of kilometers. All this can pose a long-term threat. There are long-lived radionuclides, cesium and strontium, that have a half-life period of 30 years. That is 300 years, 10 half-life periods during which they are dangerous. And spent nuclear fuel contains plutonium that has a half-life period of 24,000 years. All this, when released into the environment, can permanently turn the territory unsuitable for life. Both Ukraine and Russia may lose huge territories due to the nuclear explosion. They will become unsuitable for life due to their radioactive contamination. The threat, in my opinion, is the most serious one. The southern regions of Russia bordering Ukraine, if we take those very 200 or 300 kilometers of Russian-Ukrainian border, Kursk-Rostov region, are under the threat of radioactive contamination, and the corresponding territories of Ukraine itself as well. There are even models of the consequences of different kinds of accidents at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant created by Austrian scientists. Experts from the Austrian Institute of Ecology in 2012 created a simulation of the consequences of the accident for 250 nuclear power plants and nuclear fuel cycle enterprises in Europe, including the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The study is called Flexible Mechanisms for Nuclear Risk Assessment in Europe. It was calculated for situations in which nuclear power plants explode for internal reasons, as at the Chernobyl plant, or due to external conditions, as at the Fukushima plant. The spread of radioactive substances and contamination of territories was calculated for specific weather conditions of one of 88 days of different months in 1995. The flex risk maps provided by the Daily Storm show which areas can be affected by the spread of radioactive substances under different weather conditions. Soil contamination with cesium-137 radionuclide with a density greater than 1 curie per square kilometer can be hazardous. With high coefficients of cesium transition from soil to plants, agricultural products can be contaminated above the established standards. Contamination 10 and 100 times larger can be hazardous to human health. To assess the risk of an accident, let's look at what the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant consists of. The reactor compartments are the most potentially dangerous areas of the plant in the radiation sense. There are 6 of them at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. They contain nuclear reactors and the primary hot circuit of power units and nuclear fuel as well. And not only inside the reactors themselves, but there is also spent fuel in the spent fuel pools, but it is because of the potential danger, the reactor compartments are the most protected areas of the nuclear power plant. But again, there is no protection of the plant against shelling. Unlike the Chernobyl RBMK reactors, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant has pressurized water reactors VVER-1000 of a fundamentally different design. VVER-type reactors are much more compact, protected and safe ones on their own. They are also double-circuit, that is, the radioactive coolant doesn't leave the reactor compartment and there is no combustible graphite in them, but there is a strong steel case with a wall thickness of 20 centimeters. Pressurized water reactors, VVR in the USSR, Russian Federation, and PWR in the West are the most common type of reactors in the world. Specifically, there are 6 VVR-1000 modifications of the V320 at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Reactors of such type, except for Ukraine, operate in Russia, the Czech Republic and Bulgaria. This is a project of the 1980s. 6 power units of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant were put into operation in the period from 1985 to 1996. Another feature of the VVR-1000 protection systems is that their reactor compartments are hermetically sealed from all sides by a concrete protective shell, containment. Its walls, 120 centimeters thick, are made of pre-stressed reinforced concrete. Its main task is to prevent the release of radiation to the outside in the event of an accident at the reactor itself. Inside the VVR-1000 reactor, water circulates under a pressure of more than 150 atmospheres. In the event of its depressurization, all the escaped radioactive vapor will be kept inside the containment. The containment also protects the reactor against external influences, weather or man-caused ones. For example, it is designed for the crash of a small light aircraft weighing several tons. Modern nuclear power plant projects already have double containments and are designed for the crash of a 400-ton Boeing 747. But as I previously said, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is not designed for a full-fledged military threat. Not a single nuclear power unit is designed for military actions and military threats. This is a peaceful civilian facility, not a military bunker. So in the worst case, shelling can lead to damage to the containment, the formation of a crack or even a hole, but this in itself will not cause a nuclear accident. If the reactor is not damaged, it can operate without a containment. Only if, as a result of shelling, the concrete containment itself is pierced and there is a heat in the reactor itself or in the primary circuit equipment, then reactor depressurization and the release of radioactive steam are possible. In the worst case, radioactive steam will be released along with nuclear fuel. However, this can only happen as a result of targeted and prolonged shelling of the containment or as a result of the use of special ammunition. This cannot be done with a random projectile or bomb. After breaking through the containment, one will still need to hit the reactor, hidden deep inside the building. Contrary to common belief, this will not cause a nuclear explosion. A reactor is not an atomic bomb, even if at the time of the accident it is running at full capacity. There was no nuclear explosion either in Chernobyl or in Fukushima. The consequences of the accident will strongly depend on many factors, including the state of the reactor itself and weather conditions. In the worst case, if the reactor is running at full capacity at the time of the accident, a rather strong steam explosion is possible as a result of its depressurization. If the containment is damaged, then radioactive steam and volatile elements from the unsealed fuel will be released. First of all, volatile iodine-131 can spread over a long distance. However, its half-life period is only 8 days, and it will pose a threat for only a short time. Although most likely this will be the main threat for the general population. Also, cesium-137 with a half-life period of 30 years can be released together with aerosols, and as in Chernobyl, it can determine the main way of contamination of the territory. The volume of emissions and the scale of pollution will depend on many factors. In the worst case, the release of the nuclear fuel fragments from the reactor is also possible, but due to their weight, the level of containment damage and the configuration of the VVR power units, we can mainly talk about local contamination near the unit. If at the time of the accident the reactor has already been shut down for some time, especially if we are talking about a few weeks, then there will neither be high pressure in it that can increase the energy of the release, nor iodine-131 that decays. Therefore, from the safety standpoint, it is better to shut down the reactors of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant around which shelling is taking place. And this is already partially done. Only 3 of the 6 power units of the plant until recently were running, but at a low capacity. Speaking reasonably, it would be necessary to shut down all power units until better times, but so far, several of them are running at a low capacity. What else can happen? In addition to the reactor compartments, there is another site at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant where nuclear fuel is located. This is a dry storage facility for spent nuclear fuel. Previously, it was exported to Russia for storage and processing, but Ukraine has abandoned this practice for many years. Now they use technology that is widely used in the US and other countries. After being unloaded from the reactor and stored for several years in spent fuel pools, nuclear fuel is placed in special thick-walled concrete containers and stored on an open concrete site. The containers are quite strong and resistant to external influences, but again, they are not designed for shelling and bombing. Near the site, there have already been hits and damage to auxiliary sensors, so the possibility of damage to these containers cannot be ruled out. But then again, in the worst case, we can talk about the destruction of one or more of them damaged by direct heat. Inside them, there are no combustible materials, no high pressure, no short-lived volatile elements like iodine-131 that decays. So most likely, the potential damage is local pollution inside the perimeter of the nuclear power plant. Could the Fukushima scenario repeat itself? A nuclear power plant is a huge facility, especially the one at Zaporozhye, which is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. It covers an area of several square kilometers, and in addition to reactor compartments and fuel storage facilities, there are hundreds of buildings and structures that are much easier to accidentally or purposefully hit and destroy since they are not protected. Their destruction will not lead directly to the release of radiation, however, a number of systems are important for the normal functioning of the nuclear power plant and its safety systems. The most probable and dangerous scenario of an accident in this case is the de-energization of the nuclear power plant and the Fukushima scenario. And even after the shutdown of the reactor, its fuel must be cooled, as the decay of radioactive elements continues in it. This requires the operation of pumps, and they in their turn require electricity. The most reliable way is to take it from the power supply network. The worst option is that, if the power supply to the station is interrupted, it will be disconnected from external power supply networks due to a break in power lines, and such breaks have already happened due to shelling. In this case, the nuclear power plant has backup diesel generators, but what if they fail too? This can lead to the Fukushima scenario. This is dangerous, because the nuclear fuel can overheat, melt, leak through the reactor vessel, and as a result, break the tightness of the containment. At the Fukushima nuclear power plant, there also were explosions of hydrogen that was released during the reactions of water and superheated fuel claddings. But in this case, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant has hydrogen recombiners that operate without electricity and should not allow the formation of dangerous concentrations of hydrogen. So there should be no release of hydrogen into the atmosphere as at Fukushima. But pollution of surface and groundwater is possible. In case of the Fukushima accident, all substances float into the ocean, and such an accident at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant threatens to pollute the Dnieper River and the Black Sea as a result. So such a scenario is possible, but such an accident will develop over several days. Overheating does not happen all at once, and in this situation, the personnel of the nuclear power station, if they are helped and not interfered with, will have time to react. In fact, now the Ukrainian personnel who continues working at the nuclear power plant is fighting for the plant's survival under the conditions of incredible stress, restoring damaged systems and trying to prevent emergencies. They are all heroes, and they are at highest risk, since most accident scenarios threaten precisely with local pollution and pose a threat to the personnel and people working at the plant. Summing up, I would say that due to the design features, an accident of the Chernobyl or Fukushima scale at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is unlikely. Nevertheless, accidents are possible, including the ones with the release of radiation and local pollution. Therefore, no military actions around it are acceptable and must be immediately stopped. This is not the only nuclear power plant on the territory of Ukraine, but fortunately, no radiation accidents have happened so far, and no one died from radiation exposure. Therefore, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, despite the fact that it attracts everyone's attention and poses a potential threat in the current situation, is far from being the main and the only issue of the current historical moment. For safety reasons, the operation of power units of the plant is maintained by a minimum number of specialists. Now the situation is under control, the radiation background is at the normal level, but shelling continues, which means that the risk is still high. In the meantime, all the employees of the plant, leaving the shift home, look at the background radiation meters with hope. That's all for now. Subscribe to my channel and leave your comments to this video.